Welcome everybody to an Animas conversation. Today I'm joined with Simon Cavicchia. We're going to be talking about his latest work, his book, and the sort of things that interest him around coaching. But before we dive into that conversation, why don't we give Simon a moment to introduce himself? Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Robert. What to say? Well, I divide my time these days between working as an executive coach, mainly with senior leaders and increasingly in contexts that are quite personally and professionally challenging, where there is a degree of complexity and uncertainty in their organizational environments or in the wider context in which they're working, which pretty much applies to, well, most organizations, I think, at the moment. And I am a Gestalt trained psychotherapist. I have a small psychotherapy practice. I also supervise coaches, and I'm on the faculty of the Ashridge Masters in Executive Coaching, which I teach on and enjoy very much, sort of supporting coaches to deepen their reflective practice and then move on to qualifying with the Masters and the accreditation that we provide at Ashridge.
Fabulous, fabulous. So tell me a little bit about that Gestalt work that you do. You also said psychotherapy there, and it just jumped out as words that might be interesting just to have a look at.
Yeah, I suppose I was working as a coach and as a management consultant for a number of years before I trained as a psychotherapist. I actually did a master's at the University of Surrey many years ago called the Change Agent Skills and Strategies program, which was very ahead of its time. And it took a very integrative, eclectic and psychological approach to adult learning. Really, it was a master's in adult learning as applied to individuals, groups, and whole organization systems. And I was introduced to Gestalt as one of the theoretical lenses that we were encouraged to learn about. And back then, there were no programs that, other than this program, that actively integrated a depth of humanistic psychology and its application in organizations. And I just got very interested in Gestalt, and I had no intention of becoming a therapist, but I wanted to learn more about Gestalt. So I kind of followed my nose, really, and did a foundation year in Gestalt therapy training and enjoyed it so much that I went right the way through, qualified, and worked quite a lot as a therapist in the first few years, but now I've got a bit more balance between my consulting, my coaching, and my psychotherapy practice. And I suppose what really interests me from a Gestalt perspective is the emphasis that Gestalt places on the relationship between the practitioner and the client or the coachee, and also its holistic orientation, where we shuttle between paying close attention to what's happening in the present moment between the practitioner and the client, and the wider context in which both of us are located and situated. So I find it at the moment, in the current pandemic situation that we find ourselves in, that my Gestalt basics are really helping me and my clients to navigate the uncertainty and the loss and the personal impacts of having our worlds, to varying degrees, turned upside down, at least in the short to medium term.
Yeah, and as I hear you talk about the relationships and the context within which we're living those relationships, it really reminds me of my early days in coaching, when I used to when I first trained as a coach. I was also still working as a drama practitioner, and I spent a lot of time with a colleague of mine who was also training to be a psychotherapist. And we used to talk a lot about this idea that our practices might be different and they come from a different space within the kind of the spectrum of how we work with people. But there's something really important about the relationship that sits here and how we really tune into what is this relationship between us and what's happening in this relationship.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more evidence now than certainly was around when I was first starting my training as a Gestalt practitioner. There's a lot of evidence that's demonstrating the critical importance of the quality of relationship and the dynamics between people in creating conditions for people to learn and grow. And it struck me as really interesting that you were saying that you were working as a drama practitioner and in dialogue with a trainee therapist, and you both could agree upon or find common ground in the relationship. And a lot of the outcome research in psychotherapy that Eric DeHaan at Ashridge, for example, particularly is investigating and extending into, and has been for some time, into the world of coaching. A lot of the outcome research is showing that one of the critical factors in determining a positive outcome isn't the modality of the coach. It's not the type of training or the particular theoretical foundations that they stand in. It has everything to do with the quality of the relationship. And so what I love about having a relational orientation at my core is that that's the kind of the unifying lens. And then you can bring in all sorts of different lenses, perspectives, theories to guide your work, but firmly rooted in paying attention to how to create the optimal conditions in the relationship for change, transformation, learning to happen.
It's interesting as you talk about that. I'm reminded of the time that I first met you and you were delivering an Animas lecture and you were talking about vulnerability and shame. And I sort of go, in order for somebody to feel vulnerable in that coaching or therapeutic space, we need to have a good relationship, a good bond, a good rapport that allows us to express our vulnerabilities and to share our shaming, whether that's shaming times or our sense of shame. Without that relationship, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Yes, and I suppose there, as I hear you, where I go to is, we're talking here about a particular quality of intention that we bring as practitioners to creating the right kind of relationship environment where people can feel psychologically secure enough to, and it can take some time, obviously, because one of the ways in which we develop an appreciation of whether a relationship is permission giving and accepting is through risking to say something that we might feel vulnerable around, and then deciding on the basis of how the coach or the therapist responds whether this is an okay space. And so, in a lot of coaching theory, appropriate attention is paid to, providing core conditions. If you take a kind of a Rogerian perspective, in Gestalt, we talk about the qualities that make for a dialogic relationship. In other words, qualities of tuning into the other person, really letting the other person know how you're being impacted by them, accepting them as they are. These are all, in a way, important foundations to begin to create what also, from a psychoanalytic lens, we might call the container.
Yeah.
And that has to be in place. And the stronger that is, the more depth of exploration is possible. Also, the more it creates the possibility of differences entering into the relationship between the coach and the coachee. And from a Gestalt perspective, and also from a sort of a social psychology perspective, the idea, I find the idea that, you know, when a practitioner meets with a client, there are two subjective human beings in dialogue who have all of their histories and their differences. And those differences become a very fertile source of information, of novelty, of new perspective. It's not obviously the coach's job to impose his or her perspective, but to be able to share what's going on for me, how I'm being impacted by you, the thoughts that are arising, to be able to put those into the kind of the well, Jung used to talk about the alchemy, the alchemical container, to put my own views and my own thoughts without being attached to them. That's the crucial bit. A lot of coaching literature talks about the coach has no place disclosing what's going on for them. And I can understand why we have that principle, because we don't want people to don't want coaches to hijack the coaching to their own ends. They still need to be in service of their clients, but to not be free to share how we are being impacted and what sense we're making of the experience with our clients, I think, you know, limits possibility.
I would totally agree with you there. And I think that part of the challenge that we have in this is that there is a real a subtlety and a nuance to how we share what we are noticing about ourselves into the space. I often find new coaches can be quite, for want of a better word, clumsy with how they bring that into the space. And thus, as you say, they hijack the coaching space and it stops being about the client. But there is a quality over time that coaches develop where they're able to go, oh, I'm noticing in myself this, as you say that. And what the phrase that came to mind as you were explaining that to me was this. And I'm curious, what does that mean for you? Or does that have any resonance for you? And we're able to share our knowledge and our sense making into the space so we can jointly make sense of what's taking place and what we're looking at. And I really liked what you were saying there about this container and the alchemy that sits in this container that is between these two subjective beings in the space, because there is a magic that happens when coaching is really in flow. There's this spark or this tingle that can take place, and we get into flow and we lose track of time and all of those things. And I often talk about it as rapport. But I also get that sense that container, creating those psychological conditions to make it work, are so important.
Yes, and how I was impacted by a number of things impacted me in what you were saying, and what kind of stands out was this sense that I'm getting in my practice currently of how, if the relationship is one of allowing everything that is there to be witnessed without judgment, that is such a powerful force for enabling growth and change to happen in a way that's organic and ultimately optimal for the individual. So, you know, in Gestalt, we talk about, it's an idea from a chap called Arnold Beiser, that we talk about change being paradoxical, that change happens when we stop trying to be something that we're not and aiming for something that we might think others need us to be or we should be. And we actually relax that drive and start to shift the focus of our attention to what we are experiencing in the present moment in all its subtlety. And when I first heard that, I got it intellectually. Oh yeah, okay, so I must stop trying so hard and then change will happen. But it's taken me years, and I still am learning the subtleties of what it means to give up striving, to be somewhere else. And, you know, again, one of the great things about coaching is that it's created a discipline and a rich orientation and philosophy, drawing in large part on psychological theories and maps and models of change. And it's oriented very much towards people becoming the best that they can be, people fulfilling their potential. And I really love that positive, affirmative philosophy. The shadow of that is that it can subtly find its way into reinforcing that drive to get somewhere and to get somewhere fast. And, you know, if you really take seriously the principle that change happens in a more sustainable, profound, and naturally occurring way, the more we relax our striving. It's very, very paradoxical.
It's really interesting. It's so interesting as I hear you say that. I'm reminded of the work that I used to do with a lady called Matilda Gilbert, who's an educationalist. And we used to work in schools together, and she used to say to the teachers, stop trying to teach them this stuff. Allow them to be creative and they will learn this stuff. So you're pushing to make something happen instead of creating a space where you can allow that thing to emerge from the container, and the student to then recognize and reflect upon their learning.
Absolutely. And it's a real challenge. And I have had many struggles with this myself, you know, and going back to how do we really create these conditions as practitioners? And, you know, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that we have to do quite a lot of work on ourselves. We can't just deploy technique, however well researched the technique is, however well targeted our open questions and insightful our perspective. If we're not working on ourselves to relax our own striving, it's very hard to contribute to creating the freedom and the space that people need psychologically to. I from my spiritual practice, I've taken the word, you know, the unfolding of who we actually are, as opposed to the trying to strive to be something we think we should be. And that takes a lot of vigilance, a lot of practice, and ongoing vigilance. You know, we're all vulnerable, myself included. If I am working with somebody on an issue or something that I resonate with, that I might feel passionate about, I have to work extra hard to allow space, because even my enthusiasm affects the field of possibility in a particular way. Even if it's well-intentioned and well-meaning. So to really allow space for people to discover themselves it's a life practice and an art as much as it is any kind of science.
I often think of coaching as an art form. It's not just a way of working. There's an art and a craft to it. And when I think about the artistry of coaching, is we have to work on the instrument, which is the self. And it really resonated with me when you said, you know, we need to work on ourselves. And I guess there's a question for me here about how do coaches or practitioners do that? Or maybe the question isn't that. Maybe the question is, do they do enough of it? Are they aware of the necessity to work on oneself, and not just the skill that we deploy, but the where that skill comes from, the self?
I mean, I think a lot of it really depends on the individuals, their histories, their personalities, the ways they've been taught, the assumptions that are implicit in how they learn. So, you know, and none of this is right or wrong. I kind of really want to stress that I think it's all different, and every approach has both strengths and limitations. But I suppose I have to declare my bias, that my interest, having had a lot of therapy myself as part of my training and before I actually went into my training, and being a client for a long time and experiencing directly the freedom. It's not always easy, and it's a bit rocky at times, but the freedom that comes from deep commitment to inner work. I'm a bit of a junkie for it. I can't deny that. And now I'm not presuming that everybody will have that orientation, and people can still be fine coaches. But what I'm interested in is what changes, what becomes possible or more possible when you really have invested in the instrument. So from a relational perspective, I often say the person you are is ultimately the practitioner that you are. You can't get away from the fact that who you are is influencing how you hear your clients, how you make tentative sense and meaning from your clients, or whether you make tentative meaning. Because you might be somebody who is very oriented towards a kind of a positive stance where we think we can observe the world and define it and in an objective way. And so once we have formed a hunch, we might get very attached to that hunch and subtly and not so subtly direct the client in that direction. Now we can't help making meaning. We're meaning making creatures. But personally, I've experienced that, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done internally to move from taking my hunches to be real and truthful and seeing my own reality as ultimately sovereign. In other words, if I think it, it must be true. I mean, this might sound obvious to you and to others, but I think it certainly took me a long time to learn that my reality is a co-constructed subjective perspective, and it's not as rigid or as fixed or as certain as I might have once thought it was, or as I might have once needed it to be to feel that I was in control.
And I think there's something really interesting here. As you say, we know this to be true, or we have a sense of this. And I think, as you were saying earlier, we can have a real cognitive sense of this. We can recognize the theory that, their truth is their truth and our truth is our truth. And these things come into the space and we explore where do we sit with each other's truths in order to make meaning and understanding. And I think we can understand that from a theoretical perspective, but in the coaching session itself, I wonder how much of our old patterning creeps in and says, but this is still the truth. Their truth is untrue and my truth is truth. And how much of our bias creeps into that space.
Absolutely. Most coaches that I teach, most coaches that I meet and supervise, generally speaking, are well-intentioned, good people committed to being of service. And that can be a blessing and a curse, because if part of my subtle motivation and part of my identity depends on me being helpful, then in all sorts of subtle ways, I can either work very hard to be helpful, and if it's about me being helpful, it might tip into being less about what the client needs and more about what I need to be helpful. I can subtly, I think that distinction you make is a brilliant one. I can conceptually understand that my reality isn't my reality, but boy, at an embodied level, can I be clinging onto it like a limpet on a rock in the sea, because to really make friends with the reality that meaning is really fluid, existentially can be quite, initially at least, quite a threat to our sense of self, who we take ourselves to be. And I mean, we're seeing it, I think, amplified enormously at the moment in different governments and different leaders' responses to the pandemic. The leaders who are more able to acknowledge and talk to the complexities and own their own vulnerabilities and not knowing, but still trying to do the best they can, as opposed to those leaders who have to maintain an image of being competent, powerful, all-knowing, when in fact the evidence suggests quite the contrary. But it's very difficult for them to admit that, either to themselves or to their different political affiliations or whatever. The more we invest in maintaining a self-image, the less able we are to fluidly adjust and have the inner freedom and space to experiment with new possibilities, new versions of ourselves, new strategies. Because when we're stressed and under pressure, we tend to cling more tightly to what is known, even though what is known can never be the total picture. It's always partial, it's always got holes in it, but we cling more and more if we don't have the psychological support and resilience to just allow our experience to be as it is.
That's really interesting. It sort of reminds me of how when we become known for something, so maybe as a coach or prior to our coaching training, we are known for a way of being. Perhaps we're the one that comes up with the answers, or we're the ones that know the way forward, whatever that might be. And then in our coaching, we have to kind of let go of that. And then there's this really difficult space of, so who am I? If I am not that thing which I was defined as, who am I?
Yeah.
And if we don't go on that exploration of, well, who am I and how am I continually moving and changing and shifting, as you say, in that stress point, we revert back to that perception of a known self. And it makes me think about how when a coach is finding a session difficult, how that's when in supervision we notice they become leading or they become rigid and they take control. And it's just, I just find this stuff fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and also, of course, the way I think about these things, and it's just the way I think about them now, and that might well change, or I hope it does change, is that, you know, the idea of a session being difficult, if we unpack that for a little bit, usually in there somewhere are some very clear ideas about what a session should be like and what makes for an easy, effective session. And building on what you were saying, it might have something at times to do with a good session being one where the client has lots of insights, they achieve their objectives, they're very grateful and appreciative of our brilliance in enabling them to do it. We go away feeling capable and competent. And a bad session is one where we're not quite sure what's going on between us. The client doesn't seem to be able to make use of anything that we're offering, and we start to feel unsure. The image we have of ourselves as competent and capable starts to dissolve. And it is an image. And I mean, we're starting to get into some quite transpersonal territory here, but, you know, to the extent that we take ourselves to be those images of competence is the extent to which we suffer and feel very vulnerable or experience shame whenever the complexity of life doesn't allow us to maintain those images. And then, you know, once we start to get the idea that part of our identity is just based on images, and those images start to fall away, we will feel disoriented, lost, confused. And for a lot of us, myself included, when that starts to happen, we cling more rigidly to the images that are simultaneously getting less and less reliable. And I don't know if any other way than to go through that. You know, I was very fortunate in that, you know, I had a great therapist when I was really waking up to this reality, not at a theoretical level, but at a direct experiential level, that I had a therapist who was very, very experienced in these processes and was able to hold me psychologically as I fell apart. But I thought I was falling apart. And all he kept saying to me was, I was training as a therapist, so I kept self-diagnosing and thinking I was going crazy. And he said, no, you're not falling apart, but the images that you've taken yourself to be are falling apart. And therefore, right now, you don't have any reference points. And to have somebody normalize that was absolutely crucial. And then once we start to let go of those attachments to self-images, we start to experience ourselves differently. We no longer have to keep acting in a way that reinforces our self-images. So when a session doesn't go well, or when we experience being stuck, instead of me feeling incompetent, incapable, lost, confused, bad about myself, I am the one who is actually curious about and interested in the phenomenon of feeling stuck right now. And I can stay present to that experience without it feeling like an existential threat to my identity.
And what's beautiful is this is exactly the conversation that can then be brought into the coaching session as to, I've got this sense of stuckness, what are you noticing here and what's going on for you? And then there's this whole new dialogue that's taking place, because we're not hiding what's happening. We're throwing a light on, or bringing it into the light, what's happening, to explore it and co-explore it, as opposed to, I'm the coach, I have to stay the coach, be the coach. And that means I know the next question, or I know what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we live in a world, those of us who work in big organizations like I do, but it's not just a phenomenon you find in organizations, but we're in a culture, located in a culture and in a corporate culture that still unconsciously, or what I mean is it's conscious of doing this, it's not aware that it's doing it, that it takes for granted that leaders should be all-knowing, all-powerful. They're rewarded for doing extraordinary things against all the odds. And, if they just hit their targets consistently and they do it well and people are happy, they're not really considered to be heroic enough, or, powerful enough. We talk about extraordinary results, and for some people that can be motivating. It's particularly motivating to those people who are in the grip of pursuing those fantasies and needing to work really hard to maintain the image of competence. But one of the things we're seeing now, particularly as the kind of importance of resilience and mental health is starting to enter the organizational arena, we're also seeing that that pursuit of the extraordinary and denying myself my basic human needs for rest, relationship. A lot of very successful leaders pay a huge price in well-being, family life. They make huge sacrifices. I'm not judging it at all, but from my perspective, I'm really interested in how people can be the best that they can be, but in a way that doesn't cost them in quite the same way.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. And as you were talking earlier, there was ideas around strokes and transactional analysis that were jumping into my mind, that, when we think about a good session, part of that is that our client strokes us and we go, yeah, I did good. And then I started to think about, well, where does that need for that stroke come from? And where does that sit in our childhood relationships? And how does that all feed into it? which kind of then just builds into what you were saying, that necessity to do the work and to know and understand the self in order to work with the other.
Yeah, well, I mean, in order to have more freedom and space when working with the other.
Yeah.
I think you can still work, there are very competent, capable practitioners who have learnt very, very well evidenced and researched protocols for coaching, and they can still work and effectively with a lot of clients. For me, this is going back to your metaphor. This is about extending our construct of coaching beyond just being based on powerful technique, but on including more of the humanity and the personhood, which is a phrase that the academic John Heron, who helped set up the program I did at Surrey all those years ago, talks about personhood. The fullness of the human condition can be brought into a relational orientation to practice. And what we discover, and certainly what I've discovered, and I certainly have a long way to go here because I'm ordinary like most people deep down, is that the more we work on letting go of those internal images of how I have to be okay, and the more we welcome with compassion and a generous attitude of simple allowing everything that we're experiencing, the less we find we have to pull for strokes or mirroring, because we do that, the more we're attached or identified with an image, and we need the external environment to reflect that image. Otherwise, because it's an image, it's not actually experientially substantial. It's a bit like a hologram. It looks pretty convincing, but you try and grab it and there's nothing there. And, depending on your perspective, the way our identity forms is through a process of identification with mental content. Whereas actually, we're much, much more than that. And it's possible to know ourselves as much, much more than that directly by shifting the focus of our attention away from mental content to the direct embodied somatic experience of our body. That's where consistency and substance are to be found. So that whatever's happening with my client, if I'm connected to my visceral sense of presence, I'm a practitioner of mindfulness and meditation, if I really work on my state from the inside, then I'm much more resilient in the face of clients who don't like me, who get pissed off with me, who confront me, who are bored. I can just stay in my own equanimity and my own curiosity.
That's just some lovely words there, Simon. I kind of feel that would be a great place for us to end our conversation. But before we do, it'd be wonderful if you could just share with people where they could find you, get hold of you to perhaps continue to read about this or to converse about this.
Sure. Email address if people wanted to reach out. Is that what you had in mind?
Well, yeah, or a LinkedIn profile or website.
I'm on LinkedIn, Simon Cavicchia. The advantage of having a weird Italian name is there aren't many of us in the coaching world yet. Also the book that you mentioned that came out 2 years ago now, and I wrote it with a colleague, Maria Gilbert, and it's called The Theory and Practice of Relational Coaching. It's by Routledge, and we decided to give it the strapline of paradox, complexity, and integration. And I couldn't have known it then, but a lot of what we found ourselves talking about in the book is how does working with a relational orientation, using ourselves as instrument, how can you actually actively make use of those qualities and perspectives to help leaders faced with a falling away of certainty when the challenges that they face are of an order and magnitude and complexity that their prior knowledge, their prior learning isn't enough to help them navigate that. So theory and practice of relational coaching, and it's by Routledge, and it's still available on Amazon.
It's been a real pleasure talking with you, Simon. I look forward to having another conversation with you soon.
I'd love that. I felt like we were just getting warmed up, actually.
Let's book another one in. In the meantime, do take care. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert.